Hello, I'm Morris Barron, an attorney in the Ethics Law and Policy Branch at the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. And in this presentation, I'll discuss some items that you will want to consider before deciding to submit a CD request to OGE. With this said, let's get started. Next slide. Okay, so before we get into too much, let's talk about who would benefit from a CD. A federal employee other than a special government employee may benefit from a CD if that federal employee or another eligible person owns property that is creating a conflict of interest and preventing that federal employee from being able to participate in a particular matter. Now, in what I said, I mentioned eligible person, but we'll get to what that means shortly. For CDs, the term property is generally defined broadly and includes stocks, private businesses, real estate, and other forms of property. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to start off with some cases in which a CD will not be issued. So there are certain instances where, a federal employee just may not qualify to receive a CD. One instance is if the property is an employee benefit plan, such as a pension or profit sharing, because such plans can be rolled over into tax-deferred retirement plans, such as an IRA. So they will not qualify for a CD. Another instance is if the property is currently in a tax-deferred or tax-advantaged plan, such as a 401k or an IRA, because the taxes will be deferred automatically because that property is sitting in one of those sort of retirement plans. Another instance where a CD will not be issued is the director at OGE will not issue a CD unless the employee agrees to divest all the property that presents a conflict of interest, as well as other similar or related property that presents a conflict of interest under a federal conflict of interest statute, regulation, rule, or executive order. However, any property that qualifies for a regulatory exemption, 640, need not be divested for a CD to be issued. And that is because, the exemption takes care of the conflict there, so there's no need to divest that property. And then also, if the property was acquired under improper circumstances, for example, this may be an instance where the employee, when they purchased the property, they were prohibited from purchasing that property, due to an agency supplemental regulation. And if that's the case, then the property was acquired under improper circumstances, and OGE would not be able to issue a CD in that case. Next slide. Okay. So let's get into what does a certificate of divestiture do? The rules in 5 CFR Part 2634, Subpart J, allow an eligible person, there goes that term again, to defer paying capital gains tax on property when that property is sold to comply with conflict of interest requirements. To defer the gains, an eligible person must obtain a CD from the director of the Office of Government Ethics before selling the property. Okay, so what is an eligible person, or who is an eligible person? Eligible person means an officer or employee of the executive branch of the federal government, except a person who is a special government employee as defined in 18 U.S.C. 202. An eligible person also means a spouse or any minor or dependent child of the federal employee. And lastly, an eligible person means any trustee holding property in a trust in which an employee, a spouse, or again, any minor or dependent child just mentioned above has a beneficial interest in the principal or income of that trust. For example, an employee or a spouse, where if you have a situation where an employee or a spouse is the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable trust that holds the conflicting asset, then that trustee or the trustees of that trust would be eligible persons as well. All right, next slide. Okay, next we'll discuss what must be purchased with the proceeds of the sale of the property within inside a CD. In order to qualify for the deferral of capital gains, the eligible person must reinvest the proceeds of the sale of the property that's being divested pursuant to the CD into permitted property. And the employee must do so during the 60-day period beginning on the date of the sale of that property. The proceeds may be reinvested into one or more types of permitted property. So that leaves a question, what is permitted property? What does that mean? Permitted property means an obligation of the United States, for example, U.S. Treasury bonds, or a diversified investment fund. And a diversified investment fund is a diversified mutual fund, or a diversified unit investment trust as defined in 5 CFR 2640-102A, K, and U. However, a permitted property cannot be in any holding prohibited by statute, regulation, rule, or executive order. Next slide. Okay, so before preparing a CD request for submission to OGE, we're going to go over some points here you'll want to consider. Some of them I just mentioned briefly, but I'm just going to speak on them a little bit just along this list that you'll want to consider. One thing is, has the property already been divested? Because again, OGE's director cannot issue a CD for property that has already been sold. Another question to ask is there a particular matter? Is there a conflict? Have you chosen a remedy? Because divestiture is just one remedy. For example, is recusal workable? It may be easy or easy enough for a supervisor to assign another employee to participate in the particular matter. Is a waiver an option? In that instance, you'll want to consider, could meet the standard, for issuing a waiver. And then, what we're discussing today is divestiture an option. And even with this option, there's things to consider. Is there anything that prevents the sale of the property? For example, sometimes the employee may have a commitment to hold the asset for a certain period of time. And is that period of time going to prevent the employee from, divesting that property? Also, would selling the property take a while when the employee's services, may be needed sooner than later? For example, if it's maybe not a publicly traded stock, maybe a stock in a private company, is that going to take, more time than the agency has, in their need for the employee to work on the particular matter? But okay, in those instances, if divestiture is chosen, another thing to consider is the property held by an eligible person? So we just discussed that, and as Mathis, the property must be held by an eligible person. Also, if divestiture is chosen, is divestiture reasonably necessary? And in order for OGE to issue a CD, the property reasonably necessary to comply. I should say, divestiture of the property must be reasonably necessary to comply with 18 U.S.C. 208 or any other federal conflict of interest statute, regulation, rule, or executive order. So the question there is there actually a conflict? Another thing to consider is that, does a congressional committee require divestiture as a condition of confirmation? So this can be another instance where it makes the property reasonably necessary to divest. Is there any agency supplemental regulation requiring the employee to divest? It's another instance in which we receive CD requests where an agency has a supplemental regulation, and either for all employees or maybe for the particular employee's position, employee must divest the asset. All right. And then also sometimes in the supplemental regulations, you'll find that, there may be an exception that permits the employee to hold that asset. However, even if there's an exception in that supplemental regulation permitting the employee to retain that asset, you'll still want to consider, is there an actual conflict? And if there is, then, that would make it, reasonably necessary for that employee to divest that holding. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about the time requirement for divestiture. A request for a certificate of divestiture does not time in which an employee otherwise must divest property required to be divested pursuant to an ethics agreement or prohibited by statute, regulation, rule, or executive order. Therefore, an employee must submit his or her request for a CD as soon as possible once the requirement to divest becomes applicable. If the DAO submits a request to OGE beyond the applicable time period for divestiture, the DAO must explain the reasons for the delay. And when it comes to the time period, an employee shall be given a reasonable time considering the nature or particular duties and the nature of the marketability of the interest within which to comply with the agency's direction to divest. However, with this said, except in cases of unusual hardship, which is determined by the agency, a reasonable period shall not exceed 90 days from the date divestiture is first directed. Next slide, please. All right, one point to make before we end is public access to a CD. A CD issue will be made available to the public in accordance with the rules of 5 CFR Section 2634, 603. So that's just something that agencies should know and employees should know. Next slide. All right. Well, I want to thank you for listening. And as always, if you have any questions, you can contact your desk officer. And then I've also left my information here on this slide, and I can be contacted with as well, should you have any questions about this presentation or the CD program. Thank you.